Did you see Ai Weiwei going back to China? Yes, actually, I was going to talk about that as well. This goes back into the bracket of another major China W, like a whopping, massive, ginormous Chinese prosperity W. Ai Weiwei, who is one of the most famous critics of China and the party specifically, has gone back to China. It is literally, I think it was because of the Israel stuff. I've been following his stuff for a while. He's an artist. He's a very famous artist, and he's also a very famous China critic, right? And he's Chinese. And he spent years and years in the West. Very influential, partially because he was, a Chinese dissident living in the West, famous artist. And what's really interesting is he was doing some work around Israel's genocide in Gaza. And I remember seeing his work around Israel's genocide in Gaza, and he got insanely punished for it. Like, he got censored, he got yelled at quite a bit in Europe. And I think that opened up his eyes to the reality that, all of these systems are authoritarian, and you just have to look at results. There is an article about this. For those of you who don't know, I'll give you a little bit more about his background, but he's a Chinese contemporary artist and a documentarian. He's an activist. He grew up in the far northwest of China, where he lived under harsh conditions due to his father's exile. As an activist, he has been openly critical of the Chinese government and its stance on democracy and human rights. And what's really funny about it is he gave an interview to the Times, to Janice Turner at the Times, and I read it. And let me tell you, his attitude shift is actually very interesting, because what he has experienced being a famous dissident of China in the West, and also the collapse of liberalism that has been coming for quite a while now, has caused him to realize that while, yes, both of these systems are authoritarian in different ways, what you must look at is the results, and that the West revolves around a lie. The freedom of speech in the West, or all of the bounties of liberal democracy, is basically a lie. And what still matters most is material conditions. Now, he doesn't use that terminology, but you can make that assessment off of what he's saying when he talks about the prosperity of China and how it's undemocratic, how China is an undemocratic system, but it's one that they will not change because they see the failures of liberalism in the West. The last time I met Ai Weiwei was in 2010 in his studio in the semi-rural outskirts of Beijing. The assistant who let me in wore a t-shirt bearing the artist's brain scan, showing 2 blood clots caused by a police beating in Sichuan. Outside of Ai's home, surveillance cameras monitored his movements and visitors. Inside, the atmosphere was embattled and electrifying. Phones were assumed tapped. Ai's blog had been taken down, yet he still tweeted defiant wind-ups of a merciless regime. What's really interesting here that you must take notice is, like, he is the guy that people say, oh, try that shit in China if you can. Well, he was doing it, right? Like, he is the guy who was literally doing it in China, right? Ai Weiwei always had decent politics. He was never anti-China itself or trafficked in the crazy China will fall now or China basically Nazi stuff you hear from some. No, of course not. But, like, he had reasonable critique about the mechanisms of repression in the Chinese state. He had reasonable critique. And then he experienced the West. And when he experienced the West, his reasonable critique became even more reasonable, where he realized something that I try to explain to people all the time that is very difficult for people to understand, which is that all governments are authoritarian at the end of the day. And that the neoliberal version of control, in my opinion, in my assessment, was far better than the direct authoritarianism, but partially because I grew up under the Western style of liberties and freedoms and fraternité, égalité, liberté, right? Like I have a very like Western attitude about this sort of stuff, but at the end of the day, the results are the results. Ai Weiwei was commissioned to reflect on Germany for Zeit magazine, but they seemingly didn't like his reflections and killed the article, and he shared them. So this was one of the major turning points for him, but I'm jumping ahead here. I'm here to discuss a slim treatise called Ai Weiwei on Censorship. It describes his treatment by the Chinese government, which has erased all trace of him from the public sphere. This is one of the things that the Chinese government does, right? And sometimes for silly reasons. I was listening to a Vox.com article about a Chinese pop star who actually had a very public breakup. And when he did this, he had this very public breakup, and they did not like it at all. That like this was a couple. They didn't like that. They didn't like what it showed, so they just like kind of censored his existence. This causes a lot of self-censorship from record labels and other social media companies as well when they're making these sorts of decisions on who to highlight or promote too. So yeah, there is that kind of like silliness, especially silliness from a Western framework where you're like, who cares, right? It's just funny that like he's doing a reverse Yeonmi Park, basically. That's what it is, okay? And he was never as like insane as Yeonmi Park, obviously. I'm just saying that like he had understandable, reasonable criticisms of the Chinese mechanisms of control, which he was victim to in the silliness of it all in many respects. And now that he has like experienced the hypocrisy of the West, his attitude is changing. And that of his father, the romantic poet I King, a communist and a one-time friend of Mao who was nonetheless exiled as a rightist during the Cultural Revolution. Now I says China's censorship extends beyond its borders, the government pressuring art foundations and galleries to withdraw his work. He claims his zodiac heads were removed from an exhibition in Mexico City at the request of the Chinese embassy there. A scale model of I in prison, part of an artwork entitled Sacred. So I am keen to ask how he thinks Britain and the West generally should address the growing influence of China. Is it a hostile state trying to wield power via assaults on academic freedom and endemic spying? Should we worry Sir Keir Starmer has relinquished the Chagos Islands to Beijing-friendly Mauritius and is likely to approve a Chinese mega embassy, passing over sensitive cables leading to the city of London? But I's not a politician. He's an artist known for mischief and, to my surprise, rallies to his homeland's defense. China is never a hostile power. This is not a Chinese dissident rallying to his homeland's defense. From the Western perspective, this seems as a reflexive defense because it is baked into all of us that there is this inherent mistrust of the unknown. We have this Orientalist framework that we operate off of, and we oftentimes turn around and assume that our foreign adversaries are actually up to mischief all the time. That they're actually doing the same shit that we're doing all around the world. That's not the case. This is not a defense of China. This is just a defense of truth. China is never a hostile power is actually correct. There have been instances throughout, modern Chinese history where they have actually engaged in war or engaged in incursions. Vietnam is a great example of this, obviously, or have taken the wrong stance, oftentimes aligning with the United States of America's foreign policy in many circumstances, even though I don't personally appreciate it. Ultimately, that's not how foreign policy operates in China at all. Not militarily. If you look at history, England has invaded China 3 times. He describes the First and Second Opium Wars over self-sufficient China's refusal to buy British goods, and then the 1900 Boxer Uprising, where 8 nations put down an anti-foreigner Chinese rebellion that brought down the Qing dynasty and opened up China to the West. Now, I argues the situation is reversed. The world has 2 problems. One is created by capitalism. The other is a new world order where the BRIC nations, like India or even Russia, think we're tired of being slaves. South China Sea, guys, we can't be doing this, okay? We can't be doing this. If the standard for great powers is set by Russia and, more importantly, the United States of America, what China is doing is not even reaching that standard. The most brutal or the most ruthless thing that China does in the South China Sea is to try to bully Filipino fishermen with its Coast Guard. And the reason why they do that is because the Philippines is the only country in the region that refuses to abide by any sort of like dual security cooperative agreement. And so they just keep bullying them with water guns, okay, with water cannons. The standard is so silly in the way that we operate that we are here in the United States of America talking about bombing Venezuelan fishermen that are going off the coastline of Venezuela to Trinidad. And we consider that to be, just another day in American history and American foreign policy in our own backyard. And yet, we're murdering a bunch of fishermen. We've just arrested and deposed and kidnapped the leader of a sovereign nation. And meanwhile, we're going to sit here and act as though what China is doing in the South China Sea is remotely comparable to any of that. If this is how great powers operate, China is unimaginably restrained in comparison. That's simply what I'm saying. We're tired of being slaves. Everything you enjoy is from China. He waggles his iPhone. But if China makes 1 penny, the West will make $1. So you enjoyed 40 years of globalization and the money China accumulated rises up like water. Their level is getting high and the West is only realizing it too late. He chuckles. History is a roller coaster. Now you've passed your peak. Enjoy going down. In 200 years, you will go up again. Does he think Westerners are softer? Much, and getting weaker and weaker. We say in China, it's hard for 3 generations of a family to be wealthy because the third, they don't even know what money means. It's automatically in their accounts. So people become a designer, he laughs. China became strong because people work hard with no holidays, not just 8 hours, but 10, 12 hours. That's how they bring their children to your British schools, Cambridge and Oxford. The West, he says, cannot take tuition fees from China and then moan when it tries to restrict academic freedom or complain about Chinese spying because you've become the underdog. You cannot compete with China, so you blame it. I ask if he cares about Taiwan, Taiwan may soon be invaded. He replies it is territorially a part of China, adding, I don't think that Taiwan has that much freedom. It's just a little puppet of the Western establishment. Likewise, although he supports the release of Hong Kong protesters such as Jimmy Lai, he doesn't believe as a British colony it was ever a democracy. China, as I knows, is an autocratic surveillance state that imprisons without trial and has the world's highest execution rate. Yet in his book, he writes, at its core, censorship functions in fundamentally the same way under authoritarian regimes and in so-called free societies. Also, I don't really appreciate the way that they present the execution rate. They rarely ever explain who's getting executed. When you hear about this kind of stuff, back in the day, they used to. Western media used to cover like how, rich people, powerful people, and even party members and local officials that were collaborating when this like corrupt scheme would get executed, right? They would say, oh my God, this guy poisoned. The Chinese state has executed another person who was found criminally liable for poisoning the baby formula or whatever. And they used to do that all the time. And they used to say, look how barbaric China is. And what they failed to realize is that a lot of people were listening to that and going, wait a minute, I don't have an issue with that at all. And if you notice, they stopped covering that kind of stuff in Western news. Have you noticed? Because it's not like China has stopped capital punishment for people that they find guilty of, crimes that they consider to be very important, no matter how powerful they might be. And it's interesting that the West no longer actually mentions the capital punishment is happening. And by the way, I am anti-capital punishment. Make no mistake. I'm anti-capital punishment across the board. But it is interesting to me that people in the West now no longer cover who's getting the capital punishment. Yet in his book, he writes, at its core, censorship functions in fundamentally the same way under authoritarian regimes and in so-called free societies. Does he really think censorship is no better in the West? It is not just in China, he says, where your iPhone is listening to you. The media in the West also has strong censorship. CNN or the BBC, it doesn't matter. In China, the power is state power. But here it can be huge companies, business, even cultural institutions. His book describes how a social media post in November 2023 resulted in the cancellation of his exhibitions in London, Paris, Berlin, and New York. What I doesn't say is that just a few weeks after Hamas killed 1,200 Israelis, he tweeted in Chinese, the sense of guilt around the persecution of the Jewish people has been at times transferred to offset the Arab world. And financially, culturally, and in terms of media influence, the Jewish community has had significant presence in the United States. Both of these things are objectively true. This assessment is now very commonplace. This assessment is very commonplace, except if you are from not America or not the heart of the West. This assessment is every unc and every aunt that is, that was born and raised in any other country but the European continent, Australia, or the United States of America. I promise you, I know we often feel as the world revolves around us because we live in the heart of empire. And in many respects, it does. But there are a lot more people that see the world with this lens, which I think is closer to a closer interpretation of the truth than what the average American believes. Wasn't this just sensitivity about a recent atrocity? I breezily says that the situation developed absolutely with my prediction. I just announced it a little earlier. He said I was right, but too early. Where once his Twitter feed rallied at the Chinese government, now on X, it is solely about Gaza. He sees the conflict as a modern test for the world to say who is defending human rights, who is defending freedom of speech. There is nobody. Only the powerless people maybe walk on the street to do little demonstrations, but they are often beaten by the state police. And that evens out the so-called free world and authoritarian state because they do the same thing. I don't really understand a lot of this, to be honest. Simply put, this is a person who experienced state censorship in China. He actually was punished for it fairly severely and for things that you would never even consider to be a serious enough slight, right? Just criticizing the government in general, criticizing censorship in and of itself. Those sorts of things you can't really do in China. Okay. And as a very famous artist, he became a critic of China. He became a dissident of Chinese mechanisms of control, specifically about the Communist Party of China and the ways in which they were, stunting speech and artistic expression. This is a person who is consistent. That's what the problem is. And as a consistent person, he came to the West, as many others do, with assumptions that Westerners who wear a suit and tie and speak about how superior their culture is and how much they care about free speech. He came with those assumptions and then very quickly realized, especially when he had something in a moment of impact, when he actually had something that he wanted to be outspoken about, very quickly realized, oh shit, the Western notion of freedom of speech was simply also a lie. And it's no longer a hardened truth, but instead a malleable concept that unironically turns into a major problem if there's a moment of impact. Yeah, you can say things, you can call your president a pedophile in the United States of America, but God forbid you actually go out of your way to say maybe you shouldn't be able to shoot random moms in the face, or God forbid you say something about Israel, right? You can't do that. That goes against the fundamentals of the First Amendment that we are supposed to abide by, that we're supposed to defend. You can do that while you lie? Really? That's interesting, because someone that I know, Mahmoud Khalil, is currently being prosecuted once again after an appellate court decided to strike down his freedom for the crime of protesting against Israel's genocide. So that's really interesting that you have this notion, that you have this attitude. But on X, you can say everything? Okay, dude, you're an idiot. All right. We're talking about government's chatter. We're not talking about like what you can say on X. Anyway, I balk at his false equivalence. It's not a false equivalence. But of course you think that because you're a writer at the Times. Are Western democracies, where he now happily makes art and money without surveillance or censorship, really no better than China? The project that caused the Chinese authorities to fracture his skull, necessitating life-saving brain injury, was his naming of the 5,000 children killed in poorly constructed schools during the Sichuan earthquake. Such a story would have been blown wide open by a free press. Yeah, and what would happen in the aftermath? What would happen in the aftermath? Because when things like that happen, the Chinese government cracks down on dissidents, okay? But then you know who else they crack down on? The people that actually participated in the shoddy construction. In America, you can say that these schools are actually built shoddily. I mean, you can say we got lead poisoning happening in our schools, that our public schools are crippled, they're not being funded. But who gets punished? Now, this isn't whataboutism, because I am someone who appreciates that you can say those things. But the reality of the matter is, when you take yourself out of the equation, when you remove your own personal feelings from the equation, and you ask the question, at the end of the day, what matters more? The government actually stamping out those who are engaging in this level of corruption, but then also not allowing people to have a say in the process, or the government that allows people to have a say in the process, but then does not do anything about the corrupt forces. And that's the problem. I think you can have both. I think you can have free speech and also do Chinese-style crackdowns on those who are actually corrupt. You don't have to choose between the two. I don't believe you have to choose between the two. That's what I want. I want both. But if you were to ask the average person, your biggest flaw, okay, well, it's a little, that is unironically, unimaginably hypocritical of me to turn around and be like, listen, I don't care about free speech at all. Like, come on. That's a big part of the reason why I'm able to say what I'm saying. And I do think that there is at least like an attitude shift that I've been able to contribute to, specifically around the issue of Israel and Palestine, due to, I guess, the American laissez-faire attitude about free speech. What about Julian Assange in your British custody? Almost 12 years hiding in the embassies, he says. Or Edward Snowden, still hiding in Russia. Many believe he's a Putin asset, I say. At this, I, unused to being challenged, gets exasperated. You're interviewing artists, he says. Now you want to talk about politics? I'm interested in your opinion. I hope you can publish it. Again, immediately, this person is like, let me dunk on you. Edward Snowden is a Russian asset? Edward Snowden had to become a Russian asset for survival. The American government wanted to kill him. The American government openly fantasized about killing Julian Assange. Edward Snowden is an American patriot. It is so silly and so strange that these people turn around and have the audacity to entertain the notion that America actually values free speech. And then the moment of contradiction arrives and they say, ha, excuse me, they're actually an enemy of the state. What do you think the Chinese state says about political dissidents? They use the same logic. It's not like the Chinese state, when they're cracking down on political dissidents, goes, these guys are actually very good people and we want to prosecute them justifiably because we're evil. It's the same logic. This is the problem. These people don't understand it. When you automatically say, well, Edward Snowden is a Russian dissident. I mean, come on, he's a Russian asset, right? Like, what do you think is the reason why you're saying that? You're saying that because you're a regime defender. At least between these two places, China is more honest about its surveillance mechanism. China is more honest about what you can and can't do. In America, we're not so honest about it. And I think that's the whole point of what Weiwei is saying here. He probably would have been able to say that if he, was a little bit more invested in like politics or fully fleshed it out, rather than just like having a consistent moral position on authoritarianism and censorship and just like experiencing it personally, both in China, but then also in the West as well. I know this is unrelated to the issue at hand, but let's avoid calling Assange a Chad because he's a rapist. He was persecuted due to American lack of freedom of speech and brutality, yes, but he doesn't deserve our sympathy as an individual. First of all, he was not. That was a fake charge that you're leaning into, chatter, that the American government was like concocting. The charges were dropped. And not only that, but he was also tortured in the process. I'm pretty sure that I might be mistaken, or you might be mistaken, but I'm fairly certain that was like the governments of the West trying to find anything they could to disparage Julian Assange. There are obviously things you can say about Julian Assange, like, oh, he was like very anti-Hillary Clinton, very anti-Democratic Party, and perhaps a little too silly about MAGA initially and what Trump represented initially. And I think that is true. A lot of those guys become cranks, but he very quickly realized that Trump is also a danger. And just the same like imperialist that the Democratic Party was representing and Hillary Clinton was representing. I think he is one of those cases. He's one of those like very clear examples of just Western hypocrisy. They didn't like that he was revealing certain things, and that's it. He's not like Greenwald. No, I don't think he's like Greenwald. Glenn Greenwald still maintains that position. Like all political exiles, I clearly has a complex relationship with his homeland. His childhood was spent at the edge of the Gobi Desert, an area known as Little Siberia, where his father was forcibly re-educated by being made to clean communal latrines. The family lived in a subterranean animal shelter without light, plagued by lice and rats. In his fascinating memoir, 1,000 Years of Joy and Sorrows, he recalls his father being paraded before a barracking crowd, wearing a dunce's hat, head bowed. Yet even then, I Ching never stopped loving his country, writing elegiac patriotic poems. After Mao's death, the party admitted he'd been wrongly accused. He and his work were rehabilitated. One of the consequences of the Cultural Revolution that was certainly, not great, right? Yeah, there's definitely a lot of L's in the Cultural Revolution, let's be real. But yeah, so the point is, he got clapped on numerous occasions. He's obviously much more primed to be aware of censorship in authoritarian or seemingly non-authoritarian governments. And therefore, when he experienced this pushback, you know what's really funny, by the way? Zay Squirrel says, Ai Weiwei actually has principles. He's not a pathetic puppet that can be paraded around in front of the New York Times. Yeah, because he was outspoken about Gaza. Like, if you ask Ai Weiwei his attitude about, like, I don't know, the Islamic Republic, I'm sure Zay Squirrel would have a very different attitude about how much of a Western puppet Ai Weiwei actually is. You can't celebrate people's consistency and then also demonstrate inconsistency in certain instances. Let's move on. There are those of us who also try to maintain some semblance of consistency while being consistently anti-imperialist and get yelled at quite a bit. A society governed by regulations yet lacking individual moral judgment is more dangerous than one with none at all. A society that values obedience without questioning authority is destined to become corrupt. A society that admits to error but refuses to reflect on its origins possesses a mind as stubborn and dull as granite. Here, at a deserted street, people stop dutifully at a red light, not a car in sight. This, I once thought, is the mark of a highly evolved society. At the heart of bureaucracy lies a collective endorsement of power's legitimacy, and therefore individuals surrender their moral judgment, or perhaps never develop one. They abandon challenge. They relinquish dispute. When conversation becomes avoidance, when topics must not be mentioned, we are already living under the quiet logic of authoritarianism. When the majority believe they live in a free society, it is often a sight that society is not free. Freedom is not a gift. It must be wrestled from the hands of banality and the quiet complicity with power. This was after Ai Weiwei was commissioned to reflect on Germany for Zeit magazine, but they seemingly didn't like this reflection and killed the article. So he shared them nonetheless. When people sense that power is beyond challenge, they redirect their energy into trivial disputes, and those trivialities collectively are enough to erode a society's very foundations of justice. When public events of great consequence, such as the Nord Stream pipeline bombing, are met with silence from both government and media, the silence itself becomes more terrifying than an atomic bomb, than any atomic bomb. These are arguably pretty common views of foreigners in Germany. Zeit have managed to make it more interesting and make it the fact that it wasn't printed the most interesting thing about it. And then this person goes, the claim that the Nord Stream bombing was met with silence by the government and the media is just one of those examples that a lot that isn't standard gripes, but simple delusions detached from fact. They should have published it. It makes them look pretty bad and clueless, which James responds to with a very clear case of missing the point and proving him right about the Slavish loyalty. Have the German government treated the bombing of their infrastructure by a foreign state like an act of war? Once again, it is slavish. I know. Slavish. The point is that we have this, we have our own version of self-censorship. As someone who experienced self-censorship from others in China for the brief time that I was there, and then also recognizes how self-censorship works in the West, this is one of those versions of it. The social stigma surrounding certain truths that you cannot say, certain things that you cannot address. Okay, in this supposedly free society. When you come from that background, when you come from a country where, certain things are not allowed to be said and you will get punished by the government, even if you find them to be silly rules and restrictions, and then you come into the Western world and you realize that, sure, maybe you don't have that same level of serious repression, serious crackdowns when you say silly things, but you absolutely do experience a social stigma that creates an environment of self-censorship in order not to, offend, in order not to come across like you are not a part of the in-group. But then beyond that, the real censorship, state-enforced censorship that comes when you actually do say something of consequence at a time when the government is actively trying to stop you from saying it, you realize it's not so different than these more authoritarian countries at all. Just as though in China, you can say whatever the you want about whatever different thing you want to say, as long as you don't criticize Xi Jinping too much, or, make jokes about him, or make jokes about Mao Zedong, or numerous other, party officials or whatever. You can say whatever the you want. You just can't say certain things. So it creates an environment of self-censorship. In the United States of America, you can say whatever the you want. You can call the president a pedophile, right? You can call the president a pedophile all day, every day. You might get fired. But the moment that you say something about Israel at a time when it's inopportune for the government, at a time when the government is not fond of you saying anything at all about Israel, Joe Biden will arrest 3,500 student protesters at peaceful college encampments. He did that. That's how it goes. I'm not saying that the Chinese method here is better, for the record. I'm not saying that at all. I need you to understand. I'm simply bringing up the Western hypocrisy as one who is a major recipient of these attacks, especially as one who has been on the receiving end of an endless barrage of hatred for the last 2 years for maintaining a consistent anti-fascist and consistent anti-genocide principle and not shying away from saying what I truly mean and what I truly believe. I have been yelled at endlessly. And I still do get yelled at endlessly. Now, of course, that yelling did create an environment of censorship. That is precisely the reason why. That otherwise would have been outspoken, did not speak out about what they had seen. This is what I mean when I say there is an environment of social stigma associated with certain subjects. You think all of these people didn't realize that Israel was doing horrible things to Palestinians? Of course they did. But they saw what happened to people who spoke out? So they engaged in this self-censorship. They didn't want to speak about it until the crowd grew, and you would no longer get punished in that crowd, because there is obviously power in numbers. Same goes for speaking out against ICE. Same goes for speaking out against reactionary politics in general. It happens in a much smaller version in places like Twitch, where if the only thing that you see, the loud proclamations that you hear over and over again come from the right, and anyone that actually says, hey, this seems a little strange, I don't really like it, maybe we shouldn't be, so homophobic or transphobic, maybe we shouldn't be saying that like immigrants are rapists that need to be purged from the boundaries of the state, and you get pummeled, you get punished, and you don't often even get directionally punished for that reason, for what you're saying. They just come after you, and they find whatever they can, endlessly harassing you over and over again, creating this cycle where you are punished for speaking out against what these people want to design as the popular opinion. Same goes for Twitter.